As long as the sun shines, grass grows and rivers flow. Now that's a treaty.
And this is all called Indian Territory in the brown. But you can see they also had the 13 colonies going on where the Plymouth Rock and they were settling. And of course, Spain was trying to come in and take lands up in the middle of North America. You're not even on this map because they hadn't moved out here yet in 1763. But then they started going across here by canoes coming out this way for the fur trade. So anyway, after this 1763 Royal Proclamation in 1764, there was a big gathering of thousands and thousands of representatives of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois nations and the Anishinaabe nations at Niagara Falls. And there was a treaty made there in 1764, which really started the treaty-making process that led to the number of treaties up here. But it all came after those peace and friendship treaties in the 1760s, the Royal Proclamation, and then the Treaty of Niagara in 1764. And that led to a period leading up to after those treaties were made. You know, there was the American Revolution in 1776 where they were fighting for the independence from the British. And our Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy, had a big meeting. Some of our people wanted to fight with the Americans against the British, and some of our people wanted to fight with the British against the Americans. They couldn't get consensus within our Grand Council, so they said we're going to stay neutral. But anybody that fought, not to kill each other, just the whites. So during the American Revolution, that's what happened. Is some of our people fought with the British against the Americans, and some fought with the Americans against the British. In the end, what they did, George Washington, they burned down our villages and our crops and everything. And a lot of our people who were fighting with the British had to retreat back into what's now Canada. And that's where 6 nations of the Grand River, they were given land from the government bought land from the Mississauga Indians called the Grand River Tract, and that's where 6 Nations is today. But they were all the ones who fought on behalf of the British as British allies. But they had to retreat because the Americans destroyed everything and it scorched earth policy. My community, that we were always up, you know, on the Quebec side, so we weren't included in our villages. But many of our relatives were displaced because of that. Some came and lived with us after that. And that all led to the War of 1812, when the Americans tried to come into come across the lakes and into Canada to take over Canada. And mostly on the front lines, it was, Indian people on the front who were fighting the Americans from coming in. And I've heard a figure as high as 7,000 from some, saying 7,000 Indians died in that fight. But after the War of 1812, that's when a lot of the British who were on the American side started coming back onto the Canadian side. That's when they started making treaties for the loyalists, the British loyalists in what's now Quebec and Ontario. And that's when the numbers started to shift, where instead of us being in the majority out east, we became the minority. And that's when they started to pass laws telling us what to do. And so by 1867, we were outnumbered out east, by the settlers. And this is when they started coming up with their first constitution here in Canada. And this is a famous picture of what they call the Fathers of Confederation, the first legislative assembly in 1867, which happened in Charlottetown, out in Prince Edward Island. But this started the process of the federal and provincial governments under that constitution to take our lands and to put us under their laws. So that constitution that they passed, what I call the old constitution of 1867, that divided the powers into federal powers and provincial powers. In other words, the Parliament of Canada had legislative lawmaking authority over these subject areas here. I don't have them all listed, but you can see Indians and lands reserved for the Indians are one of the And it was under this Constitution that they passed the Indian Act. But you see, they say they have powers over defense, taxation, trade and commerce. You know, this Constitution is still in force today. Currency, banking, you know, patents, copyrights, things which we should have control over too. Even, you know, marriages and divorce and citizenship. They say those are federal powers. And because we're a subject of that law, we're not included to have these same powers. And under the provincial powers, you can see, again, taxation, management of public lands belonging to the province, which were our lands that, you know, under this Constitution that they basically just took over. Prisons, hospitals, municipalities, formalization of marriage, property and civil rights, education, and of course natural resources. That's where we got caught in the squeeze, because provinces have jurisdiction over minerals and forests and wildlife and that. So Aboriginal treaty rights were often in conflict with provincial law, historically, you know, off reserve. So like I said, the Indian Act, they passed that in 1876, and that's still in place today for the reserves and the bands that exist. And that's basically what's affected us from one generation to another. The residential school provisions were just some of the provisions in this. This controls every aspect of life, including management of reserve lands, you know, schools, leases, farming on reserve. You know, you have to get a permit from the minister to sell agricultural produce off the reserve. 75% of this Indian Act is at the discretion of the Minister of Indian Affairs. Nowadays, his bureaucracy, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, they call it. Okay. So the Indian Act has two kind of conflicting objectives. One was it was supposed to protect Indians until they could be assimilated. And that was the other part, is to control, assimilate, and civilize Indians until they were fit for Canadian citizenship. That was the two main objectives of the Indian Act. And in the 1920s, actually, they amended the Indian Act to make it illegal for Indians to hold ceremonies, to hire lawyers on land rights. That's when they stole a lot of material culture from us, our wampum belts. That's when they padlocked our longhouses and put in the elective system and locked out our traditional governments out east. In BC, that's when they took a lot of the masks and the things they used related to governance, stole them, and they're in museums now. And it was only in 1951 they took those sections out under further amendments to the Indian Act. But by then there had been a generation that had already been impacted by those laws. And the idea always was, even under the Indian Act, was that eventually we'd be assimilated as Canadians and they wouldn't need the Indian Act anymore. So, you know, about 100 years after it had passed, Canada had held consultations when Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister. And they did consultations in 1968-69 with Indian communities across Canada. And they were wanting to talk about, you know, the Indian Act. But most of the testimony that was given to them was, you know, people were saying, what about our Aboriginal rights and our treaty rights? That's what they wanted to talk about. But the government ignored that. And of course, during all this time before that, there had been treaties made. They have the peace and friendship treaties here of the Micmacs out in Nova Scotia now. The peace and friendship treaties I'm talking about around the Quebec area, they don't even have on this map. The communities I work for have done the research and shown that those treaties exist, but they haven't started getting into it with the government on them, the ones I mentioned from 1760. So the government doesn't even list them. And here they're listing these treaties. The last historic treaties they did were in the 1920s in this area, the Williams Treaty. I think it was 1923 they entered into that treaty with the bands in southern Ontario. But of course the rest, across the prairies they did the number treaties. And I should acknowledge that my wife is also a Treaty 4 in the Muscatine Pasco area. So my education about treaty came from my in-laws from down there, Treaty 4. So I do have some knowledge of the spirit of intent of treaties through my in-laws and through my wife. Next slide. Well, I should also mention that's been kind of one of the conflicting things I noticed, in talking with my wife's family, because they have this idea of treaty status that's kind of blended together. So it's kind of blended the idea of the promises made in treaty with the Indian Act, but they're two different things. Treaty and the Indian Act are two different things. What the government did was they entered into the treaty and often ignored the promises and just instead applied the Indian Act to the communities across the prairies or across the country. And these two guys were the ones who were still living with the legacy of what they did. Because you've got Pierre Trudeau, his son is now the leader, Justin Trudeau is the leader of the Liberal Party. He's still talking about his dad's paper called The Just Society, where they believed in equality, so they didn't believe in special rights like Aboriginal treaty rights. That's what led to the 1969 White Paper. And Jean Chrétien was Minister of Indian Affairs at the time, who wound up becoming Prime Minister later. So this is the cover of the 1969 White Paper on Indian Policy. A white paper is a discussion paper of the federal government, but they issued it calling it Indian Policy. And when this paper was issued, next slide. The main things it wanted to do was it wanted to eliminate Indian status by dissolving the Department of Indian Affairs within 5 years of 1969. They wanted to repeal the Indian Act, and they wanted to amend the Constitution to remove Section 9124 that talks about Indians and lands reserved for Indians. Because they were arguing that what was holding Indians back in poverty is we weren't equal. We needed equality. And in order to do that, they needed to get rid of all the references to Indians and Indian lands. And they also wanted to convert reserved lands to private property to be sold by the band or its members, transfer responsibility for Indian affairs from the federal government to the province, and integrate them into the provincial, streams of services the way other Canadians are getting services. And they've started to do that with health services. There was a time when Indians had separate health services. Now they're integrating them in as Canadian health services. And they're starting to get the provinces more involved in other program and service delivery too now. They wanted to provide funding for economic development to address some of the gaps, in the poverty, and they wanted to appoint a commissioner to address outstanding land claims and gradually terminate existing treaties, basically to buy them out. So that was the 1969 White Paper. Now, when the White Paper was proposed, that's when Indians reacted. Harold Cardinal, led the Indians of Alberta Association. The response to the White Paper is the Red Paper. Other groups like the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood came up with the Brown Paper. The Union of BC Indian Chiefs was formed. Right across the country, all these provincial organizations were formed to fight the White Paper proposals. And that's when they created the National Indian Brotherhood, to bring all the provincial, regional organizations together into one umbrella organization. And that's when, the organizations were advocating and fighting for Aboriginal treaty rights at those times. And the government started to fund them then to do that. And that all led to a debate in the 1970s. The government kept talking about Indian Act amendments. Finally, it was in 1980. And I remember this because I was at the hotel. I was a student at Trent in Native Studies in Ontario. I went down to a meeting of NIB of the chiefs, And Trudeau was there giving a speech, and he says, I want you to treat Canada better than Canada treated you. I'm going to bring the Constitution back from England, he said. And that's what started the process of coming up with a new Constitution. And during that time, from 1980 to 1982, there were negotiations between the Prime Minister, Justice Minister, and the Premiers. And at one point they put in Section 35 that said we recognize and affirm the Aboriginal treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples. The Premier of Alberta, Lougheed, and Blakey from Saskatchewan wanted that taken out. So Chrétien took it out. It was part of the give and take in the negotiations. That's when Indians across the country got organized. BC and Vancouver, they organized what's called the Constitution Express to go to Ottawa. The Métis were opposing it, the Inuit, and so there was a lot of pressure put on Ottawa to put that clause back in, because there was concern that if the new Constitution didn't recognize Aboriginal treaty rights, that would be a way for Canada to say, we don't have to deal with them anymore. And there was split, because some people didn't want it in the Constitution. There was a coalition of First Nations that was formed that said, we don't want, any mention of us in the new Constitution. And that split wasn't resolved right away. So they reinserted Section 35 with the word existing in it, and in the new Constitution. And this is the Queen signing it into law on April 17, 1982, the new Constitution. Because there's the old Constitution from 1867, the new one is this 1982 Constitution. So it became law when the Queen signed it, and it recognizes and affirms the existing. They put Section 35 in with this word existing, and they put that word existing so that they wanted it to limit or restrict a future interpretation of Section 35. They didn't want it to be so open, they wanted to narrow it. So they added that word existing. And what the courts have said is that word now means the rights that existed that weren't extinguished by the Crown before April 17, 1982. So it's the rights that existed as of April 17, 1982. And in the 1980s, they had 4 First Ministers' conferences to define the scope and content of Section 35. In 1983, they came up with a constitutional amendment to have, because the Constitution only said we only have to have 1 meeting, and that was one in 1983. But in 1983, they amended the Constitution to hold 3 more meetings. And the main issue that came out during those talks was self-government. Is it an inherent right, or is it a delegated right? The government said, well, and it comes down to Section 35, how you interpret that. The government said, it's an empty box, we'll fill it up if you negotiate agreements with us. The representatives of the Assembly of First Nation and the other national Aboriginal organizations said, no, it's a full box and we want you to recognize it. So it came down to self-government. Is self-government an inherent right, or is it a delegated right? And the governments kept proposing, the Prime Minister and the Premiers kept proposing a process to negotiate self-government agreements. And the national organizations rejected it because it was all on what they called contingent rights or conditional rights or delegated rights. In other words, they don't recognize we have any rights to self-government unless they tell us what they are. And those constitutional talks ended in failure. They didn't come to any agreement. They ended in 1987. What was being proposed was recognizing that we are a distinct order of government in Canada, separate from the federal government and separate from the provincial government. Remember what I said in the old Constitution? All they had was federal powers and provincial powers. There was no room for us. We were put in under the Indian Act. Where Ottawa told us what to do. And that law is still in place today. Ottawa's still controlling us through the Indian Act. So anyway, this was proposed and it was rejected. So in the 1983 amendment to Section 35, remember I said the word existing was added in there to narrow the interpretation of it. But they also added Section 2, 3, and 4 just defining who Aboriginal peoples of Canada are, meaning Indian, Inuit, and Métis. And this one here, they created another category of treaty rights. So there's two categories of treaty rights. Your treaties would be under the section where it says the existing Aboriginal treaty rights. So the historic treaties, a number of treaties are there. But in 1983, the Grand Council of Cree of Quebec, who signed the first, what they call modern treaty, or comprehensive claim in Canada, in northern Quebec, they signed in 1975. And they wanted to see that constitutionally protected. So they led the way with other groups who were negotiating under comprehensive claims. There were 6 groups at the time. I call them the actively extinguishing groups, but they called themselves the actively negotiating groups. And that was the Dene Nation in the Northwest Territories, the Council for Yukon Indians, the Inuit, who are now, have none of it. And the Labrador Inuit Association, and in Quebec, the Council of Tikamek-Montagnier, and the last one was the Nishka in BC. So those groups are working with the Crees, and they pushed to get this clause in the Constitution, because it says includes rights that now exist by way of land claims agreements, which is the James Bay Agreement, and may be so acquired, which is the ones who wound up signing water treaties after that. Most, like the Inuit, have done that. Most of the Dene have signed off. Most of the Yukon have signed off. The Nishka have signed a modern treaty. The Tikamek and Montagnier in Quebec, they're still negotiating. They haven't signed off. They don't like the terms the government's offering. The Labrador Inuit Association, I believe they've signed off now. So those 6 groups originally have basically gone into modern treaties, except for the Council of Tikamek-Montagnier, but they're still at the negotiating table. And the other issue that came up was, in 1983, was the fact that the Indian Act discriminated against women, Section 12(1)B, that you lose your status if you married a non-status person. So they added this in here saying that Aboriginal treaty rights are guaranteed equally to men and women. So that was what was included in the amendment in 1983. Now, 1987, the reason those talks ended was there wasn't any more provision to have constitutional conferences on Aboriginal treaty rights. What we didn't know in 1987 is that Brian Mulroney was having secret talks with Premier Bourassa about recognizing Quebec as a distinct society. So after those First Ministers' conferences on Aboriginal matters ended, Mulroney held a meeting at Beach Lake, and they signed the Beach Lake Accord with the provinces, with Quebec in Canada. And that's where they recognized Quebec as a distinct society. So basically, they pushed Aboriginal issues off the constitutional table, put Quebec issues on the constitutional table, signed this accord, but it had a different amending formula. The formula said all 10 provinces had to agree by the end of June 1990. And there were 2 provinces that hadn't agreed by June. That was Manitoba and Newfoundland. And the clock was running out on the Beach Lake Accord. And of course, Elijah Harper, who was a member of the Legislative Assembly in Manitoba, they needed total consent of the legislature under their rules to allow a constitutional amendment to go through their legislature, because they'd had debates over the French language issues before they developed these rules. And he had somebody advising him on the rules. And so he would say no. So that meant they didn't have unanimous consent that they needed. And that ran out the clock. So Elijah basically killed the Beach Lake Accord, although they put the blame on Clyde Wells, because they didn't want to give Elijah credit or blame or whatever. But once that happened, Quebec was really angry. The Premier of Quebec and many in Quebec. And about a month later, after the Beach Lake Accord died in June, on July 11th, 1990, a SWAT team was sent into Gunnesadage to enforce an injunction. And they were just blocking, they were protecting a burial ground from an expansion of a golf course from 9 to 18 holes in a stand of trees where there was, like I say, a burial ground in there. And it was old growth that Mohawk people had planted over 100 years before that. And They didn't want the golf course to be expanded, close to the burial ground, and they didn't want the trees cut down. So they had people camped in there. And a month later, like in July 11th, they sent the SWAT team in, Quebec SWAT team with guns shooting. And the people, had guns to defend themselves, so they shot back. And there was a policeman killed, Corporal LeMay. They did an inquest. They don't know, what bullet. They couldn't figure out the caliber of the bullet, so they never did determine. Both sides had automatic weapons. They couldn't figure out. He got shot underneath his arm, where the bulletproof vest wasn't. And they sent in tear gas, but the tear gas blew back in their face, and they retreated. The police retreated. So the people blocked the highway, destroyed the vehicles, and that led to a standoff. My community, which is 40 miles away from there, was on walkie-talkies with them and heard they'd been attacked. So my community blocked the highways, including the Mercier Bridge going into Montreal. And it led to a 78-day standoff in 1990. A lot of you were too young to probably remember that in here. But the Army was eventually called in, as you can see. And this is happened because there's an island right in the center of our community. They landed a helicopter on there, and they claimed they were looking for weapons. The people thought the Army was going to march across the bridge into the center of our community. And so they rushed out there to stop them, men and women. And they basically got into hand-to-hand combat with the Army. You could see they've got guns on their backs there. Anyway, the Army had to retreat because they got shit kicked out of them by the people. And this helicopter with the two blades had to pick them up and get them out of there. But, it just shows the Canada trying to impose a limit, to our sovereignty. Because this all started over golf course expansion and expanded into our land rights and our sovereignty. That became the issues. So, because those constitutional talks ended in failure, in defining what the meaning of Aboriginal treaty rights are in Section 35, the court started to interpret these people here, or the Supreme Court justices in Ottawa that sit there, and they're the final court in Canada that decides court cases about defining the meaning of the Constitution. So the first case about Section 35 came down in 1990, and it had to do with fishing rights. The Musqueam Indians were using a net bigger than what the Federal Department of Fisheries notions allowed. They argued it was their Aboriginal right under Section 35. Went up to the Supreme Court. The court said Aboriginal treaty rights are not absolute. They can be justifiably infringed or restricted for valid legislative reasons. And that's when they started to narrow the meaning of Section 35 of the law to contain it. But they did also say that if the Crown alleges that rights were extinguished, then the burden's on them to prove that it was clear and plain extinguishment. So they kind of gave a test, a legal test out, starting to interpret Section 35. They've handed down a few cases involving treaties, interpreting Section 35. One of the last ones was the Haida decision, where they said the Crown had a duty to consult and accommodate First Nations. I took this picture. These are some of the Haida chiefs in BC in court listening to the Supreme Court argue their case. What they were arguing is that the province gave away the forest and their territory from one logging company to another. They gave a license, and they never asked the Haida, do you want to have the license and manage the forest yourselves? So because they weren't asked that, they went to court and said they weren't meaningfully consulted by the government. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the court said, yes, you have a duty to consult, because they were negotiating for Aboriginal title. They said, by the time we're done negotiating, there'll be nothing left of our territory, because they're taking everything out. So the court ruled there is a duty to consult and accommodate, so kind of interim measures, and they set out a test for doing that. And then, a couple years later, they said the same thing in treaty areas, that in the treaty areas, there's a duty to consult and accommodate as well. So there's been these series of court cases kind of laying out legal tests. Often they mean millions and millions of dollars, because the burden of proof is on, Indian people to prove their rights. If they're asserting they have rights, then it's on them to prove. Which means you have to collect a lot of historical and cultural information. get lawyers, anthropologists, others to support your evidence, and most communities can't afford to do that. So, there's no real justice in that. And that's where, communities are left to face negotiating under these government policies. They can't afford to go to court. Do they do political action? What do they do? So that's been the situation. And the provinces have been coming up with their own consultation policies, trying to manipulate the Haida and Taku decision. And I guess it was 2010 that AFN signed a work plan with the Department of Indian Affairs, as it was still called. And that was said they were going to talk about treaties, comprehensive claims, education, a few other issues they listed there. That led to this Crown First Nations gathering in January of 2012. And Harper said there at that gathering that he wasn't going to amend the Indian Act, and he promised that there'd be these committees coming out of there to work together with AFN on these different issues. But they never did anything coming out of that meeting. He also dictated to AFN how many people could come into the meeting. They said only 100 chiefs could come in, or their proxies. So the Prime Minister's office decided the rules for this meeting, not AFN. And nothing came out of it, really. Now, what alarmed me was I saw an announcement on September 4th of 2013, what's convinced me that Harper was stepping on the gas to terminate our rights by assimilating us and getting rid of our collective rights. When I talk about termination, what I mean is that we have pre-existing sovereign status. Even the courts have recognized it. They said the purpose of Section 35 is to reconcile the pre-existing sovereignty of Aboriginal groups with the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. I say asserted sovereignty, but the courts and lawyers say assumed sovereignty. They're saying that's the purpose. But what I'm saying is, what the government's doing is they're, through the Indian Act as it's been amended, they're forcing First Nations, either under the Indian Act through funding agreements, or those that are in land claims and self-government agreements, basically to convert themselves from bands to municipalities, accept reserves as fee simple lands, and to extinguish inherent Aboriginal treaty rights to basically become Canadians. And I'll explain that some more. But that's what I mean when I say termination. That's the process. It's really a process of conversion or exchange. Now, one of the things Harper's government announced in September of 2013 was they were going to have a results-based approach to those groups negotiating treaties and self-government. And at the time, there was 93 tables with 403 communities, affecting over 341,945, mostly status Indians across Canada. There are some Métis negotiations in this, but it's mostly status Indians. And what they wanted to do in that results-based approach was figure out who was going to accept the offers, on the terms that Canada is saying under those policies, and those that weren't, they were going to drop them from funding, drop them from negotiations. That's what they mean by results-based. They only wanted to fund results-based tables where they'll get what they want, which is extinguishment. Here's a picture of the modern treaties. Remember I was saying that there were the ones that the Cree, Grand Council Crees of Quebec, the Labrador Inuit Association, the Dene, the Yukon. You can see they've all pretty much signed none of it. Remember I said they had none of it? So they're a territory now. So they're a public government. So the more non-Inuit that move up there and take over, they'll be taken over by the public institutions. That's the form of self-government that they went for. Anyway, you can see north of 60, which I would say are the easier issues, were addressed. And then Nishka, you can see they're there. And then Tuas is just a small little community. And there's also Manal, who's not on here. They're another small group on Vancouver Island. They've all signed modern treaties, so they basically agreed to give up their reserves, pay taxes, basically become municipal type governments within Canada. So the other thing the government did, as of April 1st of this year, all the provincial territorial organizations in Canada have their funding capped at $500,000. So FSIN, I guess Indians of Alberta, I don't know how it works out here. We've got 3, 6, 7, and 8. I don't remember that anymore. It used to be Indians of Alberta Association in the old days. They're going to be capped at $500,000. Same in BC, in Quebec, the Assembly of First Nations, Quebec and Labrador, they're going to be capped. So that means they're not going to have a lot of money to do anything to advocate for, rights or to analyze legislation or anything. So for the leaders that are, the executives that are in those organizations, they're not going to be able to do a lot for you. So for the bands that depend on these larger organizations to figure out what the hell Ottawa's doing, they won't have the money to do it. And also they've got a new tribal council funding policy. This affects the tribal council I work for. As of April 1st, tribal councils can no longer do any advocacy or political activities under the new policy. So what they have to do is either deliver programs on behalf of their member bands or do capacity building. In other words, training for the bands on how to deliver Aboriginal affairs programs better. Whether it's education, housing, welfare, anything that Aboriginal affairs delivers, that's what the tribal council is going to do. So all these organizations are basically working for Ottawa now to push Ottawa's agenda, not our agenda. That's what they're getting funded to do, or they don't get funded. Because they say Aboriginal affairs is going to decide what's an eligible expense and what's an ineligible expense. And our tribal council went to court because they're using audit and compliance rules who are critical of it. First Nations who are critical of the government. They're using audits on them, and we had to go to court in judicial review to fight them because they did an audit and they were trying to basically kill our tribal council and allege we were doing things that we weren't doing. Anyway, it wound up going into mediation. I can't talk too much about it because it was before the courts, but an agreement was worked out. But I can tell you for sure that that's a tool the government uses to try and shut First Nations up, and they're also doing it with environmental organizations. If they're critical of the pipelines or anything, they're going to use audit and compliance reviews. So all the tribal councils can no longer do any political work. They just have to help the bands work on delivering Aboriginal affairs programs the way Aboriginal affairs wants them done. And that basically means, they're also getting rid of advisory services funding, and that's the funding that a lot of the bands and tribal councils use to hire lawyers. So in one more year, they're getting rid of that. So you see what they're doing is they're gutting the ability of the organizations, your leaders, to criticize the federal government and their policies, and forcing them to work on implementing like the First Nations Education Act or, the economic development of your treaty territories, the things that the government, that Ottawa wants as their priorities. The leaders and the staff of those organizations and band offices have to go along that way or they don't get the funding. So that's what they're doing. And AFN, they've been doing that to them for a while. And you can see Diabo is pretty much going along with Harper. So it starts there, PTOs, tribal councils, right down to the band level. So bands that don't have own source revenue are stuck. You either sign the funding agreement and do what Ottawa wants, or you don't get the funding and they can put you in a third-party management. Or they'll take away the administration from your band and give it to somebody else. So some of you may remember seeing this. That's the wampum belt I was talking about that commemorates the Treaty of 1764 in Niagara. And Chief Fox is there. Chief Fox with Grand Chief Pat Dobby and Chief Isidore Day confronted Joe Oliver, who was he was the Minister of Natural Resources. Now as of today, he's the Finance Minister to replace Jim Flaherty, which is even scarier because this is the guy that's pushing the mines and the pipelines and the forestry and all the development across the country. And when this occurred in December 4th, 2012, they were voting on the Omnibus Bill C-45, which was, changing the Navigable Waters Act to remove lakes and rivers from protection, amending the Indian Act to make it easier to take reserved lands for economic purposes. It amended a whole bunch of laws. And they were voting on that when this picture happened. And I would say that this incident, and the next slide, and Chief Teresa Spence's announcement of her hunger strike and demand for a meeting with the Governor General to talk about broken treaties and the social conditions on the reserve, those two events, I think, contributed to the people coming out of the I Don't Know More movement. That's what I think. And this picture was taken January 9th by me in 2013. And there was a meeting on July 11th of 2013. AFN had meetings leading up to that. But Sean was smart. He never called a special assembly of chiefs. He just called general meetings, because if he would have called a special assembly of chiefs, the AFN charter kicks in and there's rules about how the meeting's conducted. But he didn't do that. He just called a general meeting. So basically it becomes like whatever's said here is just recommendations to the national chief and the executive. I worked at AFN a few times, so I know the charter. So this is Chief Spence coming and saying that she wants a meeting with the Governor General, and she wants all the chiefs to be able to attend, not just a handful. And she wants on the agenda the treaties and the conditions in the communities. The same demands that she'd been saying right from the start of her hunger strike. She told the meeting that. So this is the night before the meeting with Harper. You can see Sean Adlio's there, and this is Jody Wilson-Raybaud. That's the Vice Chief for BC. She's also in charge of Comprehensive Claims SOC, Senior Oversight Committee. And that's Morley Gugu behind her. That's the guy that's been pushing the First Nations Education Act. He's the Vice Chief for Nova Scotia. So they don't look too happy, because they heard Chief Fox and others at that point saying they weren't going into the meeting because the Governor General wasn't going to be there, and they weren't allowing all the chiefs in, only some. I think 30 was what they said. And speaker after speaker had gotten up and saying, I'm not going in either. I think Terry Bellegarde said that, Derek Nepanak, Gord Peters from Association of Iroquois Allied, a whole bunch of people. So by then they weren't too happy, because of course they wanted to go. And he made a big speech, Sean, and everybody thought when he made the speech that he was on side. There was consensus. Nobody was going into that meeting. But the next morning, word got out that the AFN executive was gathering at the AFN national office, and they were going into the meeting, which was in Lansdowne's Walk, the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa. And so they kind of had to go through all the people. Yeah. So, and by then, demonstrators from I Don't Know More were coming in, like thousands of people into Ottawa that day while this was going on. So there's the meeting. 30 people went in, and there's a list. And you can see the list of who went in. And the heads of Treaty 6, 7, and 8 from Alberta are in there, as are others from across the country. But there are a lot who aren't there, who didn't agree. AFN went into this meeting with 8 demands. This is what was going on outside. There were over 4,000 people outside of the room that they were meeting in Yonge. The C-45, that's the bill that Chief Fox and them, when they confronted Joe Oliver, that's the bill they were voting on, to pass through Parliament at that time. So AFN went in with 8 demands. Harper said no to all of them. They went in asking for an inquiry on murdered and missing women. They wanted all legislation to be subject to Aboriginal treaty rights in the future. They wanted some of the legislation repealed. They wanted a high-level process of discussion. That's all Harper said he agreed to. So they came out of that meeting and they set up 2 SOCs, Senior Oversight Committees. One was for treaties, historic treaties, or treaty implementation, and the other one was on comprehensive claims or modern treaties. Perry Bellegarde was in charge of the treaty implementation SOC. Jody Wilson-Raybould was in charge, from BC, is in charge of the comprehensive claims SOC. So the federal government had the same people at both SOCs, from the Prime Minister's Office, Privy Council Office, Aboriginal Affairs, Department of Justice. They were all sitting across from the AFN people at those 2 dirty SOC tables. And this woman here, I know her, Gina Whitebeck-Wilson. I heard she's not there any longer, but at the time she was there. She's now gone from Kid Against Evie. I worked with her at AFN because she worked for Over in Equity when I was there. But she was Assistant Deputy Minister for Treaties and Aboriginal Governance, so she was in charge of those SOCs as the main federal co-chair at the time. So I want to back up a bit. Harper was elected in January 2006. In this platform to form the government, he said what he promised to do, and nobody asked him for this, but he just said he's promising to do it, is he was going to replace the Indian Act with a modern legislative framework which provides for the devolution, which means basically offloading or getting rid of the full legal and democratic responsibility from the federal government to what they call Aboriginal Canadians for their own affairs within the Constitution, which means federal and provincial orders of government, no First Nations laws, including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which means individual rights over collective rights. Mm-hmm. So that's what his intent was when he formed the government in 2006. We're now at 2014. What has he done since then? When he says modern, he means assimilation of First Nations by terminating collective rights and offloading their federal responsibilities onto the local communities and the provinces. And he's using the term Aboriginal Canadians because that describes First Nations, because they want to convert Indian bands into ethnic municipalities with fee simple lands under provincial jurisdiction. Because for a while now they've been talking about the Private Ownership Act, the First Nations Private Ownership Act. From what I'm hearing, it's still supposed to be being introduced in the Parliament soon, but who knows. But they are, in the modern treaties, that's one of the requirements is if you want to settle, you have to give up your reserves and accept the lands as fee simple lands. So in BC, the Nisga'a did that already. They're proposing to do that with the Algonquins of Ontario agreement principle. So that's what's on the table to settle. And some groups, the Tuasin did it, Manaulf and the Nisga'a in BC. They've agreed to get rid of the reserves and basically accept municipal type status and, operate under that modern treaty framework, which is really a conversion process. And it puts them in under the provincial jurisdiction for most things. So they're doing this through 2 tracks. They're doing it through this modern amended Indian Act, all the bills that they've passed. The Matrimonial Property Act, the Water Act, the First Nations Accountability Act, all these things are amending the Indian Act. So the Indian Act is going to look quite different now when you look at all the consolidated amendments. And AFN has never done an analysis of it and shown it to the chiefs. Remember I said I had to do an analysis when I worked there to show the chiefs this is what the changes will mean? AFN's never done one that I've seen. The chiefs are just getting hit with one bill after another and they don't know what the full impacts are going to be on the communities yet. Nobody's done that full deep analysis yet. So if you want out of the Indian Act, the only way out of the Indian Act is negotiate a self-government agreement under their self-government policy. And if you're from a non-treaty area, you do it through comprehensive claims, like in BC or Quebec or the Atlantic provinces. So I tried to do a little chart to show you how all these bills that have passed are all feeding into the Indian Act to change the Indian Act. The Indian Act is the umbrella law But the Financial Transparency Act, Matrimonial Act, the Elections Act, Self-Government Recognition Act, which was before the Senate, I hear they pulled that back now. But all of that will feed into amending the Indian Act. And the First Nations Education Act, which is pending, is again proposing removing the sections referring to residential schools, but it will also amend the Indian Act to affect education to status Indians, which is the Indian Act. And I also put the omnibus bills here, the C-45, remember the ones I said, and C-38. Those are the ones that I don't know more was protesting. But those amended the Indian Act as well as other federal laws. So, I've outlined here the termination plan is based on key federal objectives using federal laws, policies, funding, and law enforcement. And I said, if necessary, the military, and I showed you a picture of 1990 when they used the Canadian Army on my community in Gunnersdagger. So they're prepared to use the Army if necessary, but usually they use the RCMP. Like we saw in LC Book 2 earlier this year, when they were protesting the fracking in New Brunswick, and arguing that they had Aboriginal rights and treaty rights out there. But, the provinces sent in the police to shut it down. So that's how they are forcing this plan through, is they are using force. And they're using money. And they're using their laws and policies because the money is tied to the terms and conditions. So, although they're basically pushing this through the amended Indian Act, this is really what they're pushing through those who are at self-government tables and modern treaty tables. They want those First Nations to consent to extinguishing what they call modification of Aboriginal title, but it's basically extinguishment or converting into fee simple lands. They want First Nations to sign off on the legal release of crime liability for past violations of Aboriginal title and rights. And I would argue they want the same thing on treaty rights. Even when you do treaty land entitlement, they want a legal release of the settlement that you have no more claims against the Crown. So that same principle, I'd argue, goes to treaties, but this is what they're saying to those with Aboriginal title. They want to get First Nations acceptance of the elimination of Indian reserves by accepting lands in fee simple. These are all the key parts of getting an agreement under self-government or modern treaties or comprehensive plans. These aren't up for negotiation. This is what they want. This is the core. They call them the core mandates in negotiations. That's what these are from. And I got this from a federal PowerPoint. I didn't make this up. I reworded it a little bit, to make it a little clearer, but this comes from the federal government themselves. And they want First Nations to accept removing their on-reserve tax exemptions. So the Nisga'a, Manoa, Tsawwassen, they all agreed to pay income tax, sales tax, property tax, all of that as part of the modern treaties that they're going into. And under self-government agreements, they're pushing the same thing, although I think West Bank got a kind of a special deal there with their self-government agreement because they get to keep the tax. They're collecting tax from the white people, but they get to keep it. And they're not taxing their own people yet. But I think that was a special deal. And I don't think that was under the Liberals. I doubt the Conservatives would go for that. So they also want to get First Nations to respect existing private lands, third-party interests, and therefore alienation of Aboriginal title territory without compensation. And that means all the land that's been taken or stolen illegally, no compensation for that, just accept it. They want to get First Nations to accept to be assimilated into existing federal and provincial orders of government. So that means you won't have jurisdiction, you'll have delegated authority. Any area under provincial jurisdiction, they have a veto in the negotiations, and you have to go along basically with provincial standards, like in education, FNEA, child welfare. All those are provincial areas of jurisdiction, and they have, under self-government negotiations, they have veto powers. Because it's a federal policy, and the feds give the provinces the veto power. So basically, there's no room for First Nations law in there. You have to accept federal provincial laws. You can just, have delegated authority to implement them. They want to get First Nations to apply the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. over governance and institutions in all matters. In other words, they want individual rights over collective rights. That's something the Conservatives have been pushing. Ideologically, they don't believe in Aboriginal treaty rights being collective rights. They want to get rid of them. And they want to get First Nations to accept funding on a formula basis being linked to own source revenue. And this idea of own source revenue, that's code for taxation.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they'll call it users' fees, other things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it comes from the 1995 Aboriginal Self-Government Policy, and as a local council or government collects funds from whatever source, own source, then they're going to reduce the federal transfer payments for programs and services. So as you raise more money, they're going to decrease the amount of money they're going to give your community. So you're not really getting ahead. So these are the core mandates and the main things that they've got. 93 negotiating tables across the country negotiating on that. So the conclusion I have is for First Nations who are not at a negotiating table, they're basically socially engineering First Nations into accepting the assimilation and termination plan under an amended Indian Act and using the funding. Because if you don't agree with the funding, you don't get it. Like I said, they can put you in third-party management, but they're pushing everybody in the same direction, which was eventually get rid of Indians and lands reserved for Indians to become Canadians, just like the 69 white paper proposed. And, there's more and more land and resource conflicts being across the country heating up over the pipeline proposals, the expansion of tar sands, mines, forestry, you name it. Aboriginal title and treaty lands are going to be under more increased pressure because the Harper government's looking at improving Canada's economy through natural resource development. So basically our Aboriginal treaty rights, which are lands and resources that are stolen, we're subsidizing Canada's economy by them not recognizing our rights. And they're keeping us impoverished through the Indian Act, and on welfare through that system. They don't want us to get out of that box. And that's what these policies are about, is getting us, our leaders, to sign off on it and getting us as people to ratify what our leaders are signing off on. That's the way it works. So for the first time in 40 years, First Nations organizations are going to have to reorganize because they're cutting their funding through different cuts and caps, right from the AFN level down to the band office level. And now, the community people are going to have to talk to their leaders about what are we going to do about this and where are we going to go, what are our options. So this is the first time we've really been forced to have that discussion, because we're used to somebody looking after our interests someplace else, some other organizations looking after us, we don't have to worry about it. Well, if you're a parent, a grandparent, you've got kids, grandkids, it's your responsibility now to look after the future of them because the organizations aren't able to do it. Mm-hmm. And the government's moving in on you now. So that's my presentation. I'm sorry I didn't have better news. That's the big thing. The first thing is learning about it. That's the first step. Any questions or comments?
What's your biggest question?
What's my biggest question? Is can our people get organized enough and disciplined enough to fight back on this and push Indigenous self-determination as the remedy to this, internationally as well as nationally?
This might be naive, but I come from the dumb white people, and when I was at university,
we need them to help us change Canada too.
Right. When I was in university, half of the dumb white people were in the corporate sponsorship part of the university, and half of my professors weren't being sold the corporate research part of the university, getting away from the truth. The people who weren't part of the corporate agenda were all saying that neoclassical economics, which is what's running this entire planet right now, is bankrupt and failed, and it's been propped up for the last 20, 30 years, if not longer, So basically, a classical economic model, that just there's no more money being funneled, you know, the vast bit of resources that are being thought about around the planet are being thought about by the 1%. But if there's no more money in a broken system, then we have to find out how do we, first of all, what system do we want money from? And second of all, what do we do, if that answers your question, when we organize, what do we do with this money?
Well, I agree we have to have a discussion about economy, but it can't be framed in policies that Ottawa's telling us what we can and can't do in legislation. That's the first thing. We have to start thinking outside of what Ottawa's telling us what's best for us. Education, to me, is the core. If we don't control our own education, we're in deep trouble because that's where our identity comes from. You know, parents passing on knowledge to the children and grandchildren, and grandparents. That's the core of our identity. If it's going to be the Canadian state dictating to us what the national standards are going to be, how our teachers are certified, what our curriculum is, what's acceptable curriculum. I mean, they're already controlling our organizations to say that they're working for Ottawa, not us. So they've co-opted our establishment organizations right down to the band office. We're in serious trouble. When I was working for the Algonquins of Barrier Lake, a small community 3.5 hours north of Ottawa in the bush of Algonquins, in 1987, we looked at this United Nations World Commission on Environment Development, or the Brundtland Report, after the chair, Harper. She was the Prime Minister of Norway. Her report said that, unlike other UN reports, her reports are ignored and be at our own peril. Because what she said is, and that was in the mid-1980s, she said the human species are affecting the biological processes of the planet. And we have maybe 10 years to turn it around. Then, of course, in 1992, they had that conference in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil to review her recommendations. And that's where they came up with the Convention on Biological Diversity, the first Climate Change Convention. They couldn't come up with one on forests. The point I'm making is, in there they said Indigenous people should have the right to determine their own decisions over resource matters that affect them. There should be conservation strategies. They lay out some recommendations that the Algonquins of Barrier Lake accepted, and they pushed for and negotiated an agreement under. But the industry, the forest industry, and the governments kept breaking that agreement. Because what they were pushing for was sustainable development on the ground, changing the status quo, changing the economic model you're talking about, saying we want the model to be sustainable for future generations, especially when it comes to natural resources in our territory. We have to come up with that solution ourselves, meaning the Indigenous peoples here. Our traditional values holds the source of how we should be treating each other and others, and the environment and the economy. Because, you know, traditionally we weren't greedy people. We took what we needed. Capitalism was introduced, and that's when we started to change our values. So we're at a situation, like I just went through here, where the government was deciding everything for us, directing us under the Indian Act, directing us under these negotiation policies, telling us how we should develop, what we should think, what we should feel. All of it really was to get us to leave the reserves, migrate into the cities so that we become a provincial responsibility, not a federal responsibility. Because for Ottawa, it's all about being counted. How much do we have to spend on these Indians this year? How much housing, education, welfare, etc. Meanwhile, like I said, it's our lands and resources that are stolen. We should be getting revenues from all the lands from coast to coast. There should be, just the way the provinces get, transfer payments. We should have a say in our transfer payments, not through these contribution agreements, as they call them, or loans, because they're forcing many to borrow money to negotiate their rights. In BC, the groups that are in that BC Treaty Extinguishment Process, as they call it, they borrowed almost $500 million, and they've spent over $1 billion in negotiation, and they only have three treaties, modern treaties. So we have to look for those solutions you're talking about within ourselves from the ground up, not from Ottawa or the IMF or all of that. Because managing lands and resources starts from the ground up.
Without their funding, they don't want to fund people who aren't
we're going to have to look at the options of what to do. As far as I'm concerned, that money is illegally taken anyway because they haven't resolved our Aboriginal treaty rights.
If we create our own law, like say Constitution, will Canada honor it and allow us to use it?
For some time I've been thinking, you know, the courts have these legal tests which we can't afford to meet. And because those constitutional talks ended in failure in the 1980s, I'm thinking, and I mentioned this to Owen McCready, you know, he liked the idea. I said, if we could get enough political discipline, we should be organizing and demanding that we have a political constitutional conference on Aboriginal treaty rights, not legislation.
Like, could we be our own country?
Well, I think what we have to do is restructure Canada to make it for us, because they're not going anywhere. There's about 1 million of us, and there's 30 million of them. So we need some allies that agree with us that we need to change the country to be just and fair. But 2017 is Canada's 150th anniversary. We should be organizing now in a campaign to deny them any right to celebrate that and point out to them that they've colonized us and it's time for decolonization and recognizing our rights. We have time. It's only 2014, so we've got 3 years to prepare a campaign to embarrass Canada internationally and nationally, and push for a meeting, a constitutional meeting, to say we didn't finish our talks in 1980. Let's get back to the table and talk at the highest level of your law, which is the Constitution. If we don't do that, they're going to use Section 35 to blanket us and eliminate us, because that's what they're doing now. Is they're getting us to sign agreements to empty out Section 35 of any meeting. Remember what I said about the full box and empty box? I believe it's a full box, and what they're doing is they're emptying it out through these modern treaties and these self-termination. Because through the conversion or negotiation process, we're accepting less than what we're entitled to. Even the court says we're entitled to more, but we don't have the money to go to court to prove that we have the right to meet the test of an Aboriginal right to a treaty right. Most of our communities don't pay. So the only solution I see is a political, which means we have to become aware at the community level and get organized with other communities and start telling our leaders, get out there and tell them what we want. But we have to be clear on what we want. I'm just proposing it. Maybe people will say, no, we don't think a constitutional conference is a good idea. I think it is, because I think after 30, 40 years watching this, I don't see any other way unless we come together. And that's hard to do, because each band has its own self-interest. You know, we're part of the Cree Nation here, but you're also organizing different bands in different provinces. How do you get past those divisions and come together to be one strong voice?
It's called divide and conquer.
But how do we get around it?
I had an opportunity to sit with Elder Saskatchewan, he's a senator. He said this divide and conquer policy and mentality that we've been sitting in for so long needs to be abolished. We were a sovereign nation. Unity, we weren't getting, we weren't free, we weren't all separate. The way they separated us. If we could get back to that, things are going to change in Canada.
Starts here first.
Yes. Yeah. Education, awareness, educating us on this, awareness that what it's going to come down to. You know that Gina Wilson White Duck? She was the ADM that signed off the Indian Residential School Agreement in 2007. I had an opportunity to sit in round tables, and she was instrumental in pushing a lot of, oh, let's just settle for 3,000. Let's just settle for this. Let's just settle. No, not settle. That's our right. They need to give us what we deserve. And we settled. We settled in that residential school agreement. But this divide and conquer, back to that, we need to educate, make aware, and come together as one nation, not separate nations. And that's where the difficulty lies.
Yeah.
Our leaders going to be going to be one nation. Are they going to let us divide and conquer each other? Because that's what we're doing.
It's I'm going to say that thing, but praying on his way down. The difference for the young people here, we have something that I really truly believe in. That is our inheritance to this land. We have to decolonize our thinking and our way of belief. Last night we had 2 days of band meetings at home. One more night tomorrow night. We have to present all our budgets, everything. And the CFA that was talked about was another issue. Last year we didn't sign it. This year we signed it under duress last year. I explained to the membership 3 options we provided. There were some good questions and dialogue and recommendations. Last night the mandate was given to us not to sign. Perhaps not even to accept a dime come April 1st from the government. This is how they've controlled our people for a long time. The dependency syndrome that I call it on the government to say that we can't do without the Indian Act, to me is, pardon my French, BS. So, thank you.
FSIN has documentation that the federal government also, when they took the children, they took that treaty money and they took that balance that the band was to have for the children that were in residential school. They took it from the families. And nothing was ever said in the settlement agreement about that. So if that could be something you guys fight for too, because you from your band had the largest number of residential school survivors.
2 residential schools.
There was actually, the recognized residential schools. There was other residential schools, but the residential school survivors that were in your community is huge compared to what Saskatchewan had. And the number of students that attended residential school, all that money went to the residential schools. It wasn't given to the families. And this wasn't part of the settlement agreement. So Sad Lake makes a good say, but this could let you know FSIN has that documentation.
That's something too we were told. We need to get out of FSIN. We need to get out of AFN. That's what we plan on doing.
I certainly believe from the ground up, what the chief says, Onion Lake's doing, that's the way to go. Everything I presented here is from Ottawa down. This is a national strategy, these are national policies, national plans, national laws. So the only way to turn that around is, like what Onion Lake and others are doing, is to retrace history, what makes up the laws, and pushing that forward. But it's not going to be easy because, as the chief said, Ottawa's going to push back. And that's why I say it's going to take the people. Because it's going to take the strength of the people to push back on Ottawa, because the leadership can't do it alone. They're paper tigers, basically, without the people. We pass sternly worded resolutions and letters to the people behind it. Is there anybody else here?
You said there were 93 tables.
Yeah.
Are they called something else?
They're called negotiation tables. I call them termination tables, but if you go to the Aboriginal Affairs, if you Google AANBC negotiation tables, you'll get a list, province by province and territory, which bands are at which table, where they're negotiating, and what stage are they at. Interestingly, what's interesting about that, there's a map too that shows it. But what's interesting about that is at the self-government tables, the prairies, there aren't too many bands from the prairies in there from the number of treaty areas. The ones that are there, like the Dakota, Sioux Valley just signed the self-government agreement. The Dene in the north, I think. But the main Soto and Cree communities in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba aren't negotiating self-government under that policy, I guess because of the treaty position. I find that interesting. So if you go and look at that map, you'll see in the prairies there's only a handful. But if you look at BC, most of the BC bands in Ontario. Ontario Treaty 9 is negotiating a self-government agreement under the self-government policy. Union of Ontario Indians, which is Robinson Huron, Robinson Superior treaties, they're negotiating two self-government agreements, one under education and a constitution. But like I said, that'll be delegated authority. They call it restoring the jurisdictions, but it's not that. It'll be implementing delegated authority, because they're doing it under the terms of that self-government policy. And that policy says what's on the table for negotiation and what isn't. And I guess, you know, the point I want to make here is, right from the beginning, my community was one of the first ones in contact with Europeans. And when the Indian Act was first being introduced, my community, who are farmers, were selling pig manure for fertilizer in the town of Chattagee next to our reserve. And the French farmers were complaining to the white politicians that we were selling it pig manure cheaper than what they were, fertilizer. And that's what I tell people at home. I said that was in the 1800s. We can't even sell shit without them complaining. So don't worry about them complaining about cigarettes or tobacco. Because it's about competing economies. They didn't want us to compete with the surrounding white towns economically. And on the prairies, it's the same thing. Where my wife comes from, Treaty 4, there's a book called, I think, Bitter Harvest or something, or Stolen Harvest. She wrote about how in the Cattell Valley area, they were farming, the communities, Soto communities there, and Cree communities, and they were really good at it. And they were going to agricultural fairs and learning what the latest seeds were. And of course, that's when mechanized farming was starting to come in with the tractors and that kind of thing. And the whites complained about it. That's when they started introducing the pass laws. I talked to a guy named, I think it was Alex Williams, gave me a copy of actually what a pass, an Indian pass looked like. I'd never seen one before. You know where he found it? He found it in the museum out here in Alberta. Because the only bands they applied those pass laws to were some in Saskatchewan, but mostly here in Alberta. So that the Indian agent would keep the Indians on reserve. And South Africa came and studied the Indian Act and those pass laws, and that's what they used in South Africa against the Bantu stance. The black settlements in South Africa, when apartheid was on, they had to have a pass to be allowed to leave their settlements, to go and work in the cities during the day, and at night they had to go back to their settlements. They got that from the Indian Act and the pass laws that were applied here in Alberta and Saskatchewan. They didn't apply to us in the East because we were civilized by it. It was only wild again. But he found them in a museum here, and I have a copy somewhere, but you should look at that because that's proof that they actually existed. But it was all about not wanting us to compete in the white economy.
Can you add the First Nations Land Management Act and its regime to your PowerPoint, because it's another agreement tool that the government is using to extinguish Aboriginal title and reserves as we know it into municipalities, into corporate statuses and people all at once they pass the land code into non-human people. They're corporate people.
Yep.
So I think that's something that everybody needs to be educated about, because there are 110 First Nations either have already passed it or have expressed an interest at some stage of that process, and it compromises the treaty territory when the reserves sign on to these to that particular agreement, because it's extinguishment as well.
Okay. Let me respond to that. First of all, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a policy guy. And I was working for AFN in when that law was passed, and I think originally there were only 13 bands that were part of it. They've added more on since then. We didn't have any mandate as AFN to speak about the bill when it passed, because we were focusing on that Indian Act amendment package at the time. I've looked at the bill from a policy perspective. I have questions that I would put to the lawyer. First of all, I say any band contemplating going into it, you need legal advice. Because, first of all, part of the duties of the Crown, the fiduciary duties, is what promises were made to you. The chief was referring to the treaty promises. What promises were made out here? A lot of promises were made to set up reserves. A lot of the reserves were set up through treaty. So right away, what the First Nations Land Management Act does is it transfers the band out of the Indian Act and potentially treaty provisions or promises into this First Nations Land Management Act. All it requires is a BCR. They don't even need the people's permission. Just the Chief and Council can pass a BCR to put you into the First Nations Land Management Act. They still have to apply to Ottawa to get on the list. Once Ottawa puts you on the list, then you're on there. And the only time that people come into it, the purpose of the Land Management Act is to develop a land management code. So you opt out of the Indian Act, you develop a land management code for native and non-native interests. And arguably it's a transitional step to be simple. Because what you're doing is you're starting to register different interests. It goes beyond the certificate of possession model, which the Indian Act uses to a broader registration system. And arguably it can fit with the provincial land tenure system where they can merge eventually. Because you've got a registry system that can eventually be similar to the province. But there are legal issues about opting out of the Indian Act. There are treaty promises into this act. Because you might be signing off and releasing the Crown of any liabilities for managing the lands anymore, because your band's taking over responsibilities. There could be liabilities for toxic dumps that you don't know about. Maybe PCB barrels buried somewhere on the reserve from a previous project and people forgot about it, and it's leaking into the underground water or land. You're taking those things on when you opt out of the Indian Act into that legislation. So if you don't know the legal consequences of what you're doing, you could be taking on liabilities for the band where the band will pay for the cleanup and all that kind of stuff, let alone paying for the management. So I agree with you, the First Nations Land Management Act is an issue. A lot of the bands are going into it because they're saying it's for economic development. Mostly it helps bands to their next to cities. And in Canada, a lot of the legislation that they've passed, like this Fiscal Institutions Act, they based it on Musqueam, Squamish, Vancouver, West Bank, and Kamloops. Those 4 bands they use as a model because they're all next to cities or municipalities, and they can treat their reserve lands as real estate. But for a lot of communities that are rural or isolated areas, that model doesn't work. And in fact, people only have enough land for residential purposes, not for economic purposes. So I know more and more bands have gotten into it. I don't know how many of you are seeking legal advice, but if I was advising a chief and council that wanted to do it, I'd say you better get a legal opinion. You better do a report on how was this reserve created. Because in Quebec alone, we have 7 different instruments that created reserves. My reserve was created through a seigneury, even before Canada was created in the 1600s. And Rapid Lake, one of the communities I work with, that was only created under the Provincial Lands and Forest Act, and they administered it as if it was a reserve under the Indian Act. And that was only in 1960s they passed the order of council and surveyed it. They didn't even move there until the 1970s. It's only a 59-acre reserve. So across Canada, you have different situations that this First Nations Land Management Act could affect the tax situations in different ways. So I agree with you. I should have listed it there. But I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give legal advice on whether it would hurt a particular band. All I would say is you need legal advice because it involves legal issues. And of course that's related to environment law and other land management issues. But these are all tools the government has. I didn't even get into the intervention policy, third party, the funding agreements in detail that the chief was talking about. There's a lot more tools that the government has. They said that they have money to force us in the direction they want us to go. They call it social engineering because that's what the Indian Act is. Social engineers to go in the direction the government wants us to. And they use the membership provisions, C31, MacGyver, all that's part of the package.
Community and third party, does third party take care of all this, extensively, security to all this negotiation?
Any community that's over 8% of the federal revenues that they're receiving Ottawa could demand co-management. Like you've got to hire a band manager that works for Ottawa and band both. Or they could say, okay, we're tired, you're not doing a deficit recovery plan, so we're going to appoint an administrator. And the administrator reports to Aboriginal Affairs, the community has no say. 25% of the bands in the country, I think, are in third-party management. And, you know, already, you know, there's chronic underfunding for programs and services, so it's pretty easy to slip into deficit, especially if you make an administrative mistake. And one of the problems is housing. Bands have to go and guarantee loans for band members in CMHC housing. And if you come from a big family and they say before the election, we're not going to pay our rent. And if you don't leave us alone, we're not going to vote for you. And then the band goes into deficit. They can't apply for any more housing dollars. That's how bands get into deficit. One way. There's other ways they do it. But all this is from Ottawa controlling everything.
The other thing cool about this new C-27, this fiscal policy, if you're in a third-party band, you can't get out of it using Indian Affairs money. Basically, you're always going to be in third-party, unless you have own source revenue. That's part of the new financial regime that they developed. If you're an existing nation that is in a third-party situation, you will not be allowed to use that government money to get out of third parties. So you're always going to be standing against the government. That's part of that policy.
I have children who go to school officer. I was wondering, because it said on the chart that you have their education is still pending.
The First Nations Education Act is still pending.
I was wondering, like if you ban sends people, like sends their kids off reserve, does that put them into deficit? Like if satellite refused to bus the children off reserve, would that kind of push the government to give them more funds, like maybe build a different school, like a
Well,
better, I guess?
first thing right now, the government is using the existing Indian Act to say that they're responsible for elementary and secondary only. They've always said post-secondary is discretionary, you know, the post-secondary student program. They never said it was a treaty right. We had a fight over that in 1989. Actually, Sherry Chisholm was out with me in Ottawa. We were fighting a protest then with other students. And they removed the cap that they had on at the time. So right now, that's where they're saying they give money is because of the Indian Act. You know, after the residential schools closed, that's when they started funding status Indian children to go to school offers or doing master tuition agreements with provinces. We don't know enough details yet about this First Nations Education Act. All he announced in Panay was the outlines of the act, and he said there's going to be 1.8 billion, you know, after the next election kind of thing, for new funding, but it's still going to be capped. So the funding and the control, it's definitely not First Nations control. I'm comfortable saying that it's federal control. It won't be First Nation control. But we don't know what the bill is. The bill has to be introduced in the Parliament. But the problem is Harper has a majority in the House of Commons and in the Senate. So he can pass any federal law he wants from now until just before October 2015 when the election is. And the opposition parties can't stop it. The NDP and the Liberals. They can slow it down, filibustering, you know, stalling tactics, but they can't stop him because he's got a majority vote and he can just force those laws through. And that's what he's doing. He's using his majority to keep it his way. And whenever he introduces that Education Act in, he can ram it through. And when he announced it, he said he wanted to do it before 8th September. So that means that he has to the House of Commons and the Senate by the end of June before they recess for the summer. So he's got to introduce it pretty soon if he's going to keep that schedule. You know. But we don't know yet, you know. That's one of the things I guess bands are going to have to look at. If they don't want to sign these funding agreements, are they going to do something radical like say, you deliver the services back to the government, you know, hand it back over and say, okay, it's your responsibility. That'll give them a hard time because they don't have the staff to do it. You know? But they might respond by saying, okay, if you don't want to do it, we'll put you in the third party. They'll do it. And then they take, you know, your band funds out of the use.
If our bands figure out our membership clause? Can we make our future generation status again? Or is that the secret one?
Treaty, not status. You gotta,
You
want to
can-
use, be
you
careful
can
your
put anybody-
words.
You can
Yeah.
put anybody you want in the membership code, but they're only gonna pay for the status. Can you make our future generation status again? You can make them members. You can't control status. Ottawa controls whose status and who is not redeemed. Treaty, as she was saying, they can be treaty members. You can recognize them as members of the treaties. But Ottawa will only pay for the status entities. And they do it all under funding formulas. I'm sure I'll send it next. And send it around.
There's some up there.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Patrick.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay, I've been invisible for a long, long time. I just got elected into council for Self-Termination less than a month ago. But I'm serious about being insignificant, you know, because of a status, because of a label in my community, all of a sudden I'm like a rock star. And that's not funny. You know, my name is Diabo. I did not introduce myself earlier. Maskoti Seo Tinia. I come from Lima. You know, and this is what I wanted to raise. You make the statement that Canada is socially engineering First Nations into accepting assimilation. I've been asked what I know about the First Nations Education Act and everything, all these bills. I know nothing. Okay, and it hasn't been my role to know anything because the political arena was not my arena. But when I was asked, and I admitted I knew nothing, my first question is, where's our law? And I commend my role over here, that Onion Lake, and also you guys in Saddle Lake, that are so far ahead of the game. Because we have nothing in relation to laws in our community. So not too long ago, I spoke to the elders when I started hearing about these laws, and what I said was, this is nothing new. So when you make that statement, it started in 1876. It's not a new initiative from the government, and that's just what I told the elders, you know. So really, when I say my name is Diabo, people know me also as the Cat Buffalo. That's my assimilated name. So there's forced assimilation, and then there's voluntary assimilation. Today, that's what's killing us, is that voluntary assimilation, and many times we call it victimhood. You know, so what that means is that we've been stuck in this victimhood. You know, through the residential school process, many of our people were victimized. But a person can be victimized, but 50 years later, if they're still a victim, they're no longer a victim. Now they're a volunteer. Because they volunteer to stay stuck in that rut because that's all they know. So for us, that's where we are. We are no longer victims. Now we are volunteers. Volunteers into this assimilation process. Not too long ago, I was introduced to this Munya, the people that don't understand, white guy. And this white guy claimed sovereignty right here on our land. And they call them freemen on the land. Freemen on the land. And where, for me, I have huge respect for these people. Because what they're saying is, I am not subject of the Queen. How many of us believe that we are subjects of the Queen? We're not subjects of the Queen. So this friend of mine, he gave up his identity, gave up his driver's license, his passport, his birth certificate, everything. He does not exist. He lives off the land, off the grid, generating his own power, living like a native. But he's a Munya. And for me, he taught me a huge lesson in what we can do and who we claim as sovereignty. Because for me, it's not about treaty. Treaty is an agreement. It's about sovereignty. Who are we as a people? You know, and I wanted to talk about one of the lessons that he taught me is English language. You know, in times of negotiation, everybody knows we have translators there. You know, and in a discussion, do you understand? Do you understand? And when you break down the word, What he's saying is, do you stand under? Do you stand under us? So Canada is saying to the Nehil, you understand, the translator is saying, it's no dancing. But what they're really saying is, do you subject yourself to our power? And we're saying, yes, because we installed them up. We installed them up. You know, so I wanted to make those points because in my community, and you keep referencing Supreme Court of Canada law, Canadian law, provincial law, where the heck is our law? Why do we go and make reference to the Supreme Court of Canada? And I agree with you, when it's a full box, and people think it's an empty box. For many years, I was a board member of Child Welfare, Gasoko, Nimsigopag. And I was shocked to learn that there's a statutory director, one person, one munya, that grants the delegation to our Child Welfare Services and our executive director. And at that time, I was not an elected leader. So I asked the question, where's ours? Where's ours that's equal to this person, but even better than equal, above this person? Does not exist. See, and this is what I'm talking about. It's time we stop being victims and start recognizing that we are volunteering. You know, like my brother says, we're not poor victims. We are poor victims because we've been conditioned to believe that. Many years ago, because one person died in my community, I started asking, what the heck's wrong with us here? Why are people dying around us needlessly? And the answer that came was, there's only one problem. It's the way we think. See, and earlier you made reference to the way we think up here. But really, it's the way we think right here. And that's something that I've learned a long time ago. And they yell you, walk onto it. Say what, sue it. All these laws that Idle No More talks about that are already there. We don't need validation from anybody. We got to stop playing this game of victimhood and start taking action by following the lead of my brother over here and starting to create our own laws, and we don't have to ask anyone. So as a new elected member of Samson Cree Nation, I still call it Samson Band. We still have elections, and guess where they come from? That Indian system. So, a month ago, I gave up my sovereignty. And I did it consciously because I don't see the voice at our leadership level to speak the language that my brother talks over here. I don't see it. So I gave up my sovereignty, hopefully to get a seat there so I can be a voice. And like I started with, a month ago, you know, to give you an example, I was at the gas bar. Big lineup, and I'm standing there with the mouth set. And there's a band counselor, one band counselor standing in line. And holy smoke, what a celebrity. What a rock star. A month later, I win a popularity contest because that's all it is. There's a popularity contest. Guess what? I'm the rock star today. Do I like it? No, I don't. I hate it. I hate that superficial status that's created by a foreign system. And yet that's all we know. And we just play it.
Promised us, as long as the sun shines, grass grows and rivers flow. Now that's a treaty betrayed and broken. For women heard the call to awaken us all. And now the beating of the drum is growing, calling all my relations, now native and all the First Nations. BQFNC.